at the beginning of this percent lesson, you saw this particular graph, and we're asked to just sort of, what did you notice about it? What did you wonder? Well, let me break down a little bit about this display. So this graph is showing different average tuitions of different types of post-secondary colleges, universities, versus sort of comparing public, private, nonprofit, and private for-profit institutions, and then the 4-year versus 2-year, and then looking at how their costs have changed over the last 10 years. So you'll notice the dark purple bars represent the year 2010, while the light purple bars are the 2020, 2021. And the thing about looking at a data chart like this is you might jump and immediately go, ooh, look how high that private nonprofit is. That must have, and that sort of gap between the two, tuitions seems huge. So that must be like a huge change, versus I'm looking down here at my 2-year public institutions and, they're super cheap. And that difference between the two bars doesn't look very big. So they didn't change nearly as much. But the thing is, they're not starting at the same value. And so when we talk about comparing changes, we need a better way to approach it. And that's part of what we're going to be looking at in this video, is we're going to be talking about how can we use percentages to describe the changes that are occurring. So before we dive into actual problems, we're going to do a little bit of vocabulary here. So we're going to talk about absolute change versus relative change. So absolute change is pretty straightforward. It's basically if you said, okay, how much did the dollar values in that chart actually go up? If I were to go back to this graph, if I'm looking at that public 2-year institution, if I just took the difference between 3,900 and I minus the 3,300, that would be my absolute change. That would be how much the tuition increased at those 2-year institutions over that 10-year period. And so it's the new value minus, and when we talk about the reference value, we're looking at sort of, what is our starting point is another way to think about it. So you might want to think like starting point. And absolute change, its units is whatever units we're dealing with. So, in the case of the tuition, it's dollars, like it's how many dollars the tuition went up. Versus, and this one's the more powerful one when it comes to comparing different change, we're going to look at relative change. And relative change basically compares it to a reference value. We're going to turn it into a percent, because then I can look at how many different things changed and sort of compare them on the baseline that we're taking them all out of 100%. And so another way to think about this is known as percent change. But basically what you do is you take that value we found in absolute change and then you just divide it by the reference value. That's going to get you a decimal. And then we want to write it as a percent, so you would then need to times that number by 100. And you turn it into a percent, which you practiced earlier today. So we're going to do this with, a sort of arbitrary problem, and then you're going to get a chance to practice it a little, and then we're going to keep building on it. But I'm going to give you a secret hint with all the videos today. Almost all of our formulas are going to come back to sort of these two. So you're going to just sort of see different names for them, but it's all sort of coming back to this absolute change and this relative change. All right, so we have a gallon of milk in 1999 that sold for an average of $2.88. Today, a gallon of milk sells for $3.26. I think that might be a little cheap, but we're going to go with it. So we want to find the absolute change and then the relative change in cost. Well, absolute change is the actual dollar change over, that time period. So I would take my new value, the $3.26, and I'm going to minus my $2.88, the starting value. So it's, the new minus, you might want to think of it as the original. And that's going to get me my absolute. And it went up 88. Oops, nope. Did not go up 88. It helps if I can subtract correctly. It went up 38 cents. And yes, signs do matter. In this case, this was an increase, so it's a 38 cents more expensive. If we got a negative value, then yes, it would be, a 38 cents decrease. So we care about whether or not it's going up or down. So, give yourself a little note here. Maybe actually I'm going to put it up top. I'm going to put it in red. The sign of the number matters. Don't drop it off. Okay, now let's find the relative change. So relative change builds off of what we just did, but we're going to sort of turn it into a percent. So we take that absolute change we already found, so that's 0.38, and then we're going to divide it by where we started from, that 20. So it's like, how much did it change out of how much we started from? And we end up with 0.1319. So this is a decimal, and we want to turn it into a percent. And typically with our percents, we're going to round to the nearest tenth of a percent. So in this case, that would be 13.2, because that 1 there, and there's the 9 next to it, so we'll round it up, percent. And remember, to get from a decimal to a percent, we would just multiply, by 100. But 13.2%, and we do say increase, because as I mentioned earlier, the signs matter. And this is just a really quick example of absolute versus relative change. Now, if you click on to the next slide, you're going to get a chance to take a look at that graph again, and this time you're going to be finding the absolute and relative change in tuition of those public four-year institutions, those ones right down there.